Dobrodošli na nauka.fit podcast. Kako ja znam, prvi podcast na Balkanu koji se bavi fitnessom, a utemeljen je na nauci. Ja sam vaš voditelj Ismar, a današnji gost je Milo Wolf. Milo Wolf trenutno radi na svom doktoratu, što znači da još nije doktor, ali će svakako pogledati. Današnji podcast je na engleskom jeziku, tako da ovi koji ne znaju engleski, bit će par nekih stvari na YouTube kanalu, sažetak i eventualno neki isječci glavnih dijelova sa subtitlovima, jer je malo teže čitav ovaj podcast subtitlovat. So, Milo, I made a bad joke about PhD or doctorate. It's a kind of an insider joke in Balkan,
Okay.
but I think you will get the implications of it. It goes like follows. It's a bad joke, by the way. You're not a doctor, but you will have a look.
Yeah, I get you. Yeah. Yeah.
So, tell us about yourself. When did you start lifting? How did you become addicted to it? and your academic background, and obviously your coaching background.
Sure, sounds good. So first of all, thank you for inviting me on. It's a pleasure. So my name is Milo Wolf. I started lifting when I was 15, I think. Before that, I wasn't too interested in sports, although I did do some push-ups and some curls at home. But when I started lifting, eventually, it was one of my main hobbies, and I got really interested in it. And so eventually, when it came around to deciding what I was going to study at university, I really couldn't think of anything else but sports science. So when I was 17, I applied for sports science at Loughborough University. It's a university in England, which is one of the best universities for sports. And so I went there, did my undergrad in sport and exercise science, graduated last year. So that was fun. And now I've started a PhD in sports science, and more specifically in range of motion and muscle growth. So I'm going to be looking at whether or not doing partial range of motion or full range of motion leads to more muscle growth, with some more nuances, like, for example, does it lead to more muscle growth on a regional level or just on a whole muscle level? But that's essentially the topic. And now I'm down in Southampton studying at Solon University. And yeah, so my main passion is bodybuilding. I do powerlift occasionally, but it's mostly hypertrophy training.
I was watching your Instagram channel, so thanks, Mike Israel, for recommending you, because I would never have met you. I would never have stumbled upon you, or maybe later, I don't know. And I was looking at your answers, and I really liked your answers. And then before this podcast, I was digging deeper, and I found out that I really like your stuff. So, for example, I stumbled upon this blog post on forearms, and it was so short. You're laughing because it's so short, but it's exactly what I needed at the moment. And I love your work. I want to say, when I grow up, I want to be like you. But enough of how do you say aashkriecher in England? Ass crawler. And
Yeah, I get
let's say enough ass crawling. Let's go to the meeting, to the meat of this podcast. So we're going to talk about volume. So volume in general, volume in training is like the amount of work you do. So on the most basic level. So if you run 1 kilometer, you run the other day 2 kilometers, you haven't done double the volume, for example. Is it correct me if I'm wrong, everything. And in hypertrophy training, volume is, we can go in more nuances, say volume load, reps times load times sets and stuff. But in general, volume is the amount of hard sets or working sets you do between 6 and 30 reps. So we can say there's a little more hypertrophy in 6 reps or a little bit less, but on average it's like the same. And by hard sets, I mean between 4 reps in reserve and 0 reps in reserve, which is failure. And we have these volume landmarks, these and recommendations, like average recommendations. And I want to emphasize that these recommendations are like the average for the average consumer, for the average lifter, but they do not apply to every person. Like when we will start about volume length parks, we will say some recommendations. For example, I don't know, maintenance volume, 6 sets per muscle group. But I just want to emphasize that these are not set in stone. So they can vary from person to person, and especially from muscle group to muscle group. So I want to start with how fast do muscles, do we lose muscle when we stop lifting?
Okay, that's a good question.
A broad one.
Yes. So there's something to consider here. First of all, in some sense, you're always losing muscle, like every moment, essentially. So the protein in your muscle, so essentially your muscle, let's say, is regulated by 2 things. One is the building, which is called muscle protein synthesis, and one is the breakdown. And then on balance, if you're synthesizing more proteins than you're breaking down, you're gaining muscle. But if you're breaking down more protein than you're synthesizing, then you're losing muscle. But at all times, both are happening. So you're actually always losing muscle. But then a better question would be, in what time frame would meaningful muscle loss occur? And that answer is a little bit more complicated. So we have some studies where people train for 6 weeks. We have one study in particular, I think it's it's a Japanese name, so it's going to be hard to pronounce, but it's Ogasawara, I think. So it's a study that was conducted about, I think, 8 years ago, where people trained either for, I believe, 18 weeks straight, or the other group trained for 6 weeks, then took 3 weeks off, then trained for 6 weeks, and then took 3 more weeks off. And essentially, across the whole 18 weeks, both groups gained the same amount of muscle mass, despite one group taking 3 weeks off twice. And during those 3 weeks, you would expect there to be some muscle loss and some strength loss. But in reality, there was very little of that stuff going on. And we also have a fair amount of evidence now showing that muscle is very easy to maintain. So you can do very little volume and still maintain muscle mass. So whatever it takes you to gain muscle mass, you'll need a lot less than that to maintain muscle mass. So yeah, the short answer, I suppose, would be for meaningful muscle loss, like something you can actually measure and or see yourself, I would say at least 1 or 2 weeks. But as I said, on a very pedantic note, muscle loss occurs all the time. It's just at some point it becomes more meaningful. But you can definitely take some easy strategies to counteract it, like training a little bit goes a long way. And I will say training for muscle growth and for maintaining muscle mass is a lot more important than just getting protein in. So on the effect of how much muscle mass you're able to retain. So for example, if you just ate optimal protein, but you didn't train, you would still lose muscle mass. Whereas if you trained fairly well, but didn't eat much protein, you'd be just fine. So training is a lot more important. Training is essentially the stimulus for muscle growth, that sets it off. But then protein is what sort of allows you to act on that stimulus and actually build the muscle. That makes sense.
So obviously, if we are bed rested, if we don't walk, we lose quads all the time, or quads, hamstrings, and other muscles in the legs. And if we walk, essentially we are synthesizing protein. Is this a correct assumption? Okay.
Yep, it absolutely is.
Yeah. So astronauts, I heard once. I don't know if it was on the Joe Rogan podcast, but astronauts. The astronaut that was interviewed said, before we were thinking high reps are better, but now we know that lower reps, strength-based, maintains more muscle. And I was like, duh, but this is another topic. So you said that the muscle loss doesn't occur, but what about if we do other sports? Like, if, for example, if we box, jump and stuff, does it... can we expect less or prolonged muscle maintenance if we are doing some sports?
Sure. So sports will contribute to maintaining muscle mass to some extent. As you said, when you're in bed rest is a very extreme scenario. But when you're in bed rest, for example, you're going to lose muscle mass pretty quickly. Same with astronauts. They have to use stuff like resistance bands because it's not gravity anymore. It's a band, it's elastic force. And so sports can help to maintain muscle mass because you don't need much volume to maintain muscle mass. But if you want to maximize growth and you're doing another sport, that's going to present some level of interference. So there's two main fronts, or three if you want to be practical, on which having both hypertrophy training and training for another sport can interfere. So first of all, on a molecular level, there are two pathways. One is called mTOR, one's called AMPK. Essentially, one is mostly responsible for building muscle, let's say. It's a very simplified version, but the mTOR pathway is for building muscle, and the AMPK version, the AMPK pathway is responsible for endurance adaptations. And so when you're doing another sport, depending on how endurance focused it is, what the demands of that sport are, on a molecular level, you'll be stimulating the AMPK pathway. And the thing with these pathways is, to some extent, when you're activating one, you're deactivating the other, which means when you're training for endurance, you're activating the AMPK pathway, and that automatically turns down the mTOR pathway, which is building muscle. So even on a very chemical basic level, training for different things at the same time tends to not be the best. Then the second implication of training for different things at the same time is you have limited recovery. You can only recover from so much volume or training intensity, etc. And so if you're doing, let's say, 2 hours a week of some other sport, that's fatigue you're producing that could be gotten from hypertrophy training instead, but with the additional stimulus you get from it. So anytime you're doing another sport, you could instead be doing more hypertrophy training and getting more muscle growth out of it. And then finally, the third implication, which is a very practical and simple one, is you don't have infinite time. And so hypertrophy training takes time already. If you have, say, 6 hours a week to train for hypertrophy, and you want to train for, say, MMA as well, the time you have for hypertrophy training is going to drop a bunch and your volume is going to drop. So yeah, I think training for two different sports at once is pretty complicated.
Okay. Let's focus on hypertrophy training, and let's put sports out of the way, because my channel is mainly, and yours as well, is mainly hypertrophy. So let's dive into these volume landmarks. Maintenance volume is maybe the most easiest to understand, because I think it's the easiest to understand, because the other ones are like a range and stuff, and we're going to get into these nitty gritty and these nuances. So essentially, what is maintenance volume and how low is it? How much? How do I say this? How much can I get away with training the least and maintaining muscle?
Sure. So maintenance volume, as you pointed out, it's the amount of volume you need to maintain muscle mass. It probably does change over time and between circumstances, but it probably doesn't change a ton. Like as you become more trained, for example, it might increase a little bit, but it's still going to be very low. So, sorry, what was the second question?
I was asking if what is essentially maintenance volume, and how much is it for let's say larger muscle groups, let's say.
Okay, so for most muscle groups, assuming you're intermediate or advanced, I think that'll be around 0 to 5 sets a week per muscle group, and that's hard sets. Again, as you pointed out earlier, that's hard sets between 5 and 30 reps roughly, and within 5 reps of failure. But yeah, so maintenance volumes are very low, and they can differ from muscle group to muscle group. Like for example, your hamstrings might need less volume to maintain than say your biceps or your delts. But overall, I'd say for most people, somewhere in the 1 to 7 set range is a pretty good starting point.
Can I maintain my hamstrings with sprints? I train, by the way, sorry. That's what I was going to say. I'm training 6 or 7 years, I think, and I'm 6'1", a little bit shorter than you. So, and I have nice hamstrings, let's say. I don't want to brag, but they're pretty decent. So can I maintain my hamstrings with sprints if I can't go to the gym, for example?
Yeah, sure. So I couldn't really speak to whether you could or not, because there's so many unknown factors I don't know about. But if you've been training hamstrings for more than, say, 5 years pretty hard, and they've grown quite a bit and stuff, and you're quite used to doing resistance training, like you've been doing a lot of volume for a while, your maintenance volume probably isn't going to be met by just sprinting. It depends on your caloric deficit. Like if you're in a deficit, for example, then it'd be even harder. But for example, if you're gaining weight, then I'd be fairly confident in you being able to maintain. Because essentially when you gain weight, you're always going to gain some proportion of fat and some proportion of muscle. So even just being in a surplus is going to drive up how much muscle you gain. And so when you're not able to access weights for, say, RDLs, leg curls, and that sort of thing, gaining weights, or at least maintaining, is a very good idea, because that'll help with retaining muscle mass. So in your situation, potentially, if you play your cards right, you sleep well, stress is low, your sprints are, you feel they're stimulative of hamstring growth. You have good SFR with them, let's say. So yeah, it's possible.
It's possible. I'm asking because every time we had a lockdown and obviously the gyms didn't work in England, they're still not working, or they're again not working. So they're again closed, and I was trying to put up. I had a pull-up bar, and I had the push-ups and the squats, obviously, and some isolation with shoulders and stuff. And I was like, hamstrings, it's impossible, and I can't do this Nordic curls. They are too hard and kind of too I don't know. I heard Mike once said you can for 1 or 2 weeks maintain hamstrings with sprints, so that would be possible. Let's talk about the other volume landmarks. So let's switch up gears to minimum effective volume. Minimum effective volume is basically one of the main signs that you progress, that you are building muscle, is if your numbers go up statically. So if we talk about minimum effective volume, it's you can lift more weight in a subsequent session. So what are some other characteristics of minimum effective volume? How do we know what's our minimum? How do we find out what our minimum effective volume is?
Sure. So again, as you defined, minimum effective volume is the least amount of volume you need to see any measurable improvement in performance or muscle mass, whatever you're trying to accomplish. It's usually quite low as well. Like, it's probably lower than most people think. It's likely essentially just above maintenance volume, because maintenance volume is by definition the volume you need to maintain. To gain, usually it's just a bit more. Now, if I said 1 to 7 sets for maintenance volume, in most circumstances, I think for minimum effective volume, it would be around, say, 5 to 10 sets per week per muscle group. And perhaps even less, depending on what you're training. For hypertrophy, I think it's 5 to 10. But for strength, for example, there's been, we're working on a paper with some colleagues where essentially 1 set to failure per muscle group per week on 15,000 people, so it's a big sample, was enough to see their strength increase for 6 years. 6 years? Yep, 6 years.
1 set.
And this isn't like crazy genetics or anything, because it's 15,000 people.
Yeah, that's interesting.
And that's 1 set a week. That's 20 minutes of training a week. And they were still able to gain strength across 6 years. So again, for some stuff like strength, for example, MEVs can be very low. And I think for hypertrophy, because to some extent, strength and hypertrophy do go hand in hand. So I think MEV for hypertrophy is often lower than people think. But yeah, so MEV is usually between 5 to 10 sets. Performance can be a decent proxy for MEV. Like, as in, if you see your performance increasing week to week, you can be fairly certain you're at MEV or above. Now, the issue with that for muscle growth specifically is strength isn't a one-to-one reflection of muscle mass. So when you're gaining strength, it doesn't necessarily mean you gain muscle mass. It could just be you gain proficiency with a technique. Maybe you, assuming technique is standardized, like same range of motion and everything, Then it could be improvement in technique, neuromuscular improvements, pennation angle changes, like those sort of things.
What is pennation angle changes? Is this what is pennation angle changes?
Sure. Pennation angle is essentially the angle at which your fibers are oriented, and depending on how they're angled, that can be more effective for strength. So there's a bunch of changes that can occur that aren't muscle size that do improve your strength or worsen it. So week to week, you could be improving those factors, but losing muscle mass and still getting strength. So performance is some proxy of it, and it's probably one of the better ones. And in the short term, it's probably one of the only ones you have, because muscle, like to visibly change a muscle in size is pretty hard. Then RP have come up with some proxies of MEV, pump, soreness, and mind muscle connection. I think they're okay, but I think they're too crude to really reflect whether or not you've reached MEV. I think it's mostly just a matter of tracking your numbers over the long term, over mesocycles and mesocycles, and seeing, okay, consistently, when I do 5 sets a week per muscle group, I see improvements in performance. If that happens over, say, 6 to 12 mesocycles in a row, you can be pretty sure that around 5 sets is at least your MEV. So yeah, that's how I'd go about determining MEV. And the good thing is, for beginners, anything is MEV. Like 1 set is MEV, because you need literally just anything to grow, because you've done nothing before. And by the time you're not a beginner anymore and you need to worry about what your MEV is, you've already done 6 to 12 mesocycles. And so you know what your MEV is. So it sort of solves itself.
Yeah. The study is interesting. When is it going to come out? This 15,000 strength, 6 years. Yep. And can I ask you one more question before I answer that? What about hypertrophy over those 6 years in those people?
Sure. So the study was it's a company called Fit20 in the Netherlands, which is essentially like a gym chain, from what I understand, where people come in, they train once a week, and they track all the numbers, like they track everything as far as strength goes. And so we have all the data from 15,000 people over between like 1 and 6 years. And so the issue with hypertrophy is they didn't measure hypertrophy. It was just strength.
Okay.
But it was compound exercises, 1 set to failure a week. And they measured strength every week because of the working weights, because it was failure. So they measured like working load every week. And it's going to come out. I think the preprint is out already. Preprint is essentially before an article is properly published. You can put it out beforehand, and then people can read it. And I think that's out already, but it's been submitted for publication as well, which should be happening hopefully within a few months. But sometimes these things take a long time. So
can't wait to see it, because it's pretty interesting stuff. Let's talk about the MRV, so maximum recoverable volume. You already hinted at that we have a certain amount of recovery ability we can do. So I want to ask you, you have a lot of clients who obviously come in and train like 15 sets per muscle group per session. And you lower obviously the volume because it's outside of their recovery abilities. How many times do we see changes in performance by lowering their volume? Because the mindset is always more is better, and obviously RP guys said we wanted to make the volume landmarks, especially for those people who are doing more and think more is better.
Yep, 100%. So in my experience, there are 2 types of people who aren't getting their best results when they come to me. The first kind, as you mentioned, is people doing way too many sets. Oftentimes, it's not that they're doing just way too many sets, but it's also that each of their sets isn't done close to failure. So they're essentially making up for too much volume by taking their sets really far from failure, which is essentially junk volume. So that's one demographic I sometimes come across. And then there's another one, which is people who just don't do enough volume, lack of consistency, not training hard enough, that sort of thing. But yeah, some people do more volume that they can recover from, but you'd be surprised at how hard that is. you need to train very hard and for a lot of volume for you to not be able to recover anymore. And that usually manifests itself with other symptoms like your performance goes down week to week. Your sleep goes to shit often. Sorry for the profanity.
No.
Your mood goes down. You're not interested in training anymore. Your motivation goes down. You get anxious pre-training, like your stomach gets upset before you squat, for example. So there's a lot of symptoms that come with overreaching and training above your maximum recoverable volume. But yeah, essentially, max recoverable volume is how much volume can you do and still recover performance week to week or session to session. So for example, let's say in week 1, you benched on Monday 100 for 10. And then on week 2, you come back and you get 100 for 9 to failure again. That indicates you didn't recover from Monday to Monday. Whereas if Monday week 1, you did 100 for 10 again, and then Monday week 2, you did 100 for 11, that indicates you not only recovered, but also got some adaptation because you got stronger. And then if you got 10 again on second week, then that means you recovered. In a sports science definition, recovery is defined as a return of performance to baseline, so pre-disruption. So for example, if you benched 100 for 10 on Monday, and that's your baseline, and then because you did that set, your muscle was disrupted, your performance got worse, and then recovery occurs when your performance is back to you being able to do 100 for 10. And then what happens after that, that's adaptation. That's gaining muscle mass, gaining strength, and so forth.
Yeah, I have a friend who has all the symptoms of overtraining, and he trains like, I'm training with him all the time, and he trains like 15, 16 sets per muscle group, and he goes to failure. So I know it from first hand. And I'm always trying to make him do at least an active rest, but he doesn't listen. He has the mindset of more is always better. And I was like deloading this week. I was deloading, and he was looking at me. I had a 25-minute workout, and he was looking at me like, "You are going to lose all your muscle, you idiot." And I was like, "Okay, whatever." But anyways, we'll come to deloads in a minute. Let's talk about MAV. So this it's minimum. No, what is MAV? I always forget.
Maximally adaptive volume, I think.
Yeah, and it's a range, of course, like all these they move. So what is maximally adaptive volume? I can't say it.
Sure. So as the name indicates, it's the volume with which your adaptations will be maximized. And adaptations for us means you'll get the most muscle growth out of it. And typically it's slightly above your MEV and slightly below your MRV. So let's say your MEV for hamstrings is 8 sets and your MRV is 20 sets. Your MAV might be between, say, 10 sets and 18 sets. It's a range because if you visualize an inverted U curve with volume being on the x-axis and growth being on the y-axis, there is a range of volume which, for all intents and purposes, produces the same growth. Like it sort of peaks, and then there's like it's a very not steep gradient, and so it's pretty much the same growth at a variety of volumes. And so it's a range. It's virtually impossible to determine exactly what your MAV is, like to a single number. But yeah, so it's a range at which you get your most effective training in, and you get the most muscle growth out of it.
Let's talk about first of all, how do these landmarks change with training age? So for beginner, for intermediate, and for advanced.
Sure. So the trend is the same from beginner to intermediate to advanced. As a beginner, your maintenance volume is 0 because you've never trained, so you need nothing to maintain. You can just keep doing what you've been doing.
Except if you're going to space and are an astronaut, then it goes like
true, yeah, or bed rest or something like that.
Yeah.
But then your MEV as a beginner is 1 set, literally, because you've always been doing 0 sets, and so 1 set is enough to grow you. And your MAV is probably not much higher than that, because you're so training with weights is so novel to you that even a few sets is enough to give you a lot of muscle damage, really cause a lot of fatigue, and your recovery rate is quite slow. There's something called the repeated bout effect, which is essentially saying, okay, as you repeat a stimulus, for example, training, your body responds with muscle damage. As you repeat that stimulus, the muscle damage response decreases, which means over time, as you do the same session, for example, you'll get less sore and so forth. So for a beginner, MAV is very low again, and your MRV is also super low. Then as you train and train, as I said, the repeated bout effect kicks into action, and your MRV grows and grows and grows. And so as an intermediate, for example, your MRV on average might be, on average, for the average muscle group, for the average person, maybe around 15, 20 sets, 25 sets perhaps.
Yep.
And at the same time, because you've been training for a while, your MV, so your maintenance volume, increases because now you've been training for a while and you're used to training, and so you need something to keep your muscle mass there, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
And your MEV also increases, which means you need to do more than before to see any gains at all. And finally, because your MEV and your MRV increase, that also means that your MAV increases, because they essentially take MAV with it, because your best results occur between getting some gains and then maximizing your gains. And so MAV increases, and then as you become more and more trained, your maintenance volume goes up. You need more volume to keep maintaining your muscle mass. Your minimally effective volume also goes up. You need more training to see any results at all, as you can see in some very trained people who need 10, 15 sets a week sometimes to gain anything. And then your MRV, after a while, your MRV doesn't really change anymore, because you've been exposed to resistance training so often that, for example, the repeated bout effects doesn't really do much anymore. You've been lifting for years and years. And so, yeah, your MV, your MEV go up, your MAV goes up slightly because your MEV is increased, but your MRV is essentially not really moving much from intermediate to advanced.
Okay. Another question, how do these change in when I'm dieting? So essentially when I'm in a calorie deficit and compared to a calorie surplus or maintenance, for example. So what happens in a calorie deficit? Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I'll base it off maintenance because that's the normal state, I suppose. When you go from maintenance to a surplus, your maintenance volume decreases because, as I said, when you gain any weight, any actual tissue, some of it's going to be muscle, some of it's going to be fat. And so even when you're not training, you're still going to gain some muscle mass, provided that you're not super trained already. Which is why you see really high fat-free masses, for example, in sumo athletes or NFL, very heavy NFL athletes. When you're a surplus compared to a maintenance, your MEV also goes down, as I said, because as you gain weight, you gain some muscle mass as well. Your MRV probably slightly increases because you have more glycogen available. It's easier to resynthesize, and so you can sustain more training. And the repair of muscle damage is likely takes some energy. And so by having more energy available, you're able to repair muscles more quickly, more effectively, and so forth. And then when you go into a deficit compared to maintenance, it's essentially bad news all around. Mm-hmm. Your maintenance volume goes up because now for every kilogram you lose, for example, some of it will be muscle mass, unless you take you train, you up protein intake, that sort of thing. And so you have to fight against that in the first place. Then your minimally effective volume goes up because now your minimally effective volume means you need to make gains. So you not only need to not lose stuff, you also need to gain stuff, which makes MEV go up quite a bit. And then your MRV actually goes down because you have less energy available, which means you're able to repair muscle damage less effectively. You have less glycogen available, which means training recovery between sets, for example, takes longer. It's just bad news all around. And so during a cut, oftentimes, for a lot of people, your best objective is just to maintain muscle mass, because gaining muscle mass in the cut can be quite difficult.
Yeah, so we have to fight all these, like you said, glycogen and basically our recovery ability goes down. So this window, we have to train more and we can't train much more. So to put it in simple terms, how do life stressors affect these? Is it the window psychological life stressors? Is the window shortening with these as well, or?
Yeah. So in practice, the effect of life stressors on training is quite similar to the ones of cutting. So we have some studies where, for example, undergraduates undergo exam stress and they assess recovery from a single session. And there's stuff like the group that didn't have exams took, for example, I think it was 48 hours to recover from a session. So recovery defined as performance goes back to baseline. But the group that did have exams took around twice as long to recover. And so essentially recovery worsens quite a bit. Your body doesn't differentiate between physiological stressors, so for example, lifting weights or an injury, and stress, psychological stress, chronic stress, that well. And so they sort of all get lumped into the same pool, and you can only recover from so much stress. And so if you add more psychological stress, but you're still training the same, at some point that might become too much, and recovery is going to keep lagging behind. And so when you're stressed compared to when you're not very stressed, your MRV goes down. You're able to recover from less volume because you've already got stress coming in from other areas. Your maintenance volume goes up because there might be some stuff with like cortisol, for example, which is a catabolic hormone, down-regulating how much muscle you can build and that sort of thing. For the same reason, your MEV probably goes up, so your minimally effective volume goes up. And because your MRV went down and your MEV went up, you have a small range for MAV, but it's also slightly higher than usual.
Yeah, exactly.
So yeah, bad news all around.
Bad news all around. Is it good to have a high MRV for hypertrophy? Is it good or is it bad? Are people with the train, they can tolerate a lot of volume, more jacked or less jacked?
Sure. So there are two ways of answering this. The first one is having a higher MRV than someone else probably isn't that good for you. If anything, it might be worse. That's because there are sort of underlying physiological characteristics like your fiber type. So type 1 fibers, slow twitch fibers. Essentially, that means they take longer to build up to their maximum force production. They can only grow so much, and faster fibers, type 2 fibers, tend to grow more. They have a larger potential for growth. And typically people, and they also, so slow twitch fibers also recover more quickly, which means people with slower twitch fibers are able to recover from more volume and they have higher MREs, but they can also not grow as much in the long term because slower fibers don't have the potential to grow as large as faster twitch fibers. And also in a more practical sense, training more takes more time. Time is a valuable resource. That's not very fun. But then the second way of answering this question is within people. So if you look at people in two different situations, for example, let's say me 1 year ago, okay? 1 year ago, somehow I was stressed out of my mind, in a deficit because I couldn't eat. Protein intake was all over the place. Couldn't sleep, just how I was. And so because of all those things, as we mentioned, your MRV goes down. You can't recover from as much volume, which in this case probably isn't a good thing. Because if you want to maximize your growth within a person, you want to maximize your recovery. So you can do more volume, get more muscle growth out of it, and still recover. But then let's say now, today, I feel great, good sleep, no stress.
I didn't ask you how you feel at the start of the interview. I didn't ask how you feel. Sorry for my impoliteness.
No, it's fine. My MRV is very high, I assure you.
Okay, that's the answer. How are you? My MRV is very high. Okay,
very high, very high.
Mine too, good.
So when you're not stressed, your nutrition is good, protein intake is good, calorie intake is high, sleep is good, everything. Your MRV increases, or at least increases compared to when you're stressed, etc. Mm-hmm. And so within a person, you likely want to do all the things you can do outside of training to maximize your MRV. But between people, having a higher MRV probably isn't better and might even be worse.
Thank you for this. I'm missing a word. Thank you for this beautiful answer. Let's leave it with that. I'm missing my vocabulary. You know, it's not the best in English. Let's put this all together. So let's put it, we know what MEV is, MRV is, maintenance volume. So do we train at the MRV most of the time because it's like the best, or MAV most of the time because it's the best? How do we put all of these landmarks together in a training program, and how, if we know them, or if we are assume that we know them?
Sure. So keep in mind, everything I'm about to say, very speculative. It's very hypothetical. It's based on studies that aren't designed to test for this. It's based on inferences. So essentially we take studies on certain topics and we say, okay, so this happens, so maybe this is going to happen. So everything I'm about to say, very speculative. I wouldn't be surprised if, for example, training at MAV all the time was just as effective or more effective than training from MEV to MRV. That being said, you can make a decent case based on the available evidence that training from MEV to MRV is a good idea. Essentially, when you're done with the training cycle, you've taken a deload, you've dropped fatigue, your muscles have resensitized to training to some extent. You likely don't need that much volume to progress in terms of building muscle mass. So training at MEV is just fine. It also allows you to minimize injury risk, because the less training you do, the less injury risk you get. The more you expose yourself to training hard, training heavy, etc., the more your injury risk goes up. And so because you're going to be training for, say, 4 to 8 weeks anyways, you might as well take the easy weeks fast, minimize the injury risk, and minimize fatigue buildup so you can have a long, productive mesocycle. So starting around MEV is a good idea. And then week to week, we have some evidence now showing that increasing volume compared to what you were doing before likely increases muscle growth. So we have one direct study, for example, which was released, I think, in the past year now, where they had 2 groups. One group, they just assigned a set amount of volume, which is, I think, like 10 sets a week. And the other group, they asked them, okay, how many sets were you doing before we started the study? And they told them. And then instead of just giving them 10 sets, for example, they told them, okay, you're going to do this amount of volume plus 20%. And the group that was assigned to the plus 20% volume amount grew more than the group that was just doing a set amount of volume, a random amount of volume, essentially. So it does seem that increasing volume, at least to some extent, in some time frame, increases how much muscle growth you can get, at least provided you can recover. And so we have some rationale for increasing volume week to week. And also there's stuff like the overload principle, which is a very broad principle, but it might be relevant to. And so week to week, because also volume has one of the most causal and linear relationships with muscle growth out of most variables, up to an extent, of course. And you know, if you do so much that you can't recover, then that's not good. But within a certain range, it has a pretty good relationship with growth, more so than, say, proximity to failure or frequency or intensity. So it seems like if we're going to manipulate any variable, volume seems like the one to go with. And so week to week, we increase volume, and eventually we go into MAV, so maximally adaptive volume, which is where you get likely the most growth. And then because we want to keep increasing volume relative to last week, provided you cover, of course, then we eventually reach MRV. And around that time, training fatigue and psychological fatigue, I think psychological fatigue is often understated when people talk about this. At the end of a hard training mesocycle, while your performance can technically recover session to session, and that might indicate that you're physiologically recovered, psychologically, when you've been doing hard training for weeks and weeks and weeks, at some point you start disliking training, and at some point it's not going to be your performance that's lagging behind, it's your motivation to train anymore. So at the end of the mesocycle, you reach MRV, and training at MRV isn't very sustainable. Largely because of psychological factors, but also because of physiological factors. So at some point, performance is going to lag behind, and you're not going to be able to keep training productively. And so you hit MRV, and you can exceed MRV for maybe a week or two at a time and functionally overreach. And then you're going to have to deload.
You said
there's
week.
No way to... a week or two, perhaps, yes.
A week or two, okay.
Yep. And then that's called functional overreaching, which is essentially when you go above what you can recover from for a short amount of time, and then you deload or you take a period of reduced training, so that then the supercompensation can occur, and you get essentially the adaptations you didn't get back then because you weren't fully recovering. So yeah, that's essentially why we progress from MEV to MRV. It's because it makes sense in the grand scheme of things. It does have some practical implications, like it takes more time. It's a little bit more stressful to plan out. It can be difficult to fit into your lifestyle. For example, if you've got exams coming up and it's MRV week, or it's like overreaching week, that might not be ideal. And so for some people, just having static sets can be a lot better. But if you want to optimize things for hypertrophy, I think it makes some sense.
You said composition. Sorry. What's the evidence say on supercomposation? I can't say it. Supercomposation in hypertrophy.
Oh man, there is not a lot.
Not a lot.
Like a lot of things, yeah, not a lot. Like a lot of things for hypertrophy, there's just not that much evidence yet. There's been a few studies where it hasn't been shown to occur, but there's been one study recently, I think in the last 2 or 3 years. I think it was like in Norway or something.
I know, yeah.
I think Bjornson, I think, where essentially they had powerlifters, I think, do blood flow restricted front squats. And they trained them pretty hard for a week or two, then gave them some time off. So essentially during those 1 or 2 weeks, they overreached and then gave them some time off. And after those 1 or 2 weeks, they measured their muscle size, etc. And after those 1 or 2 weeks, I'll re-explain. After those 1 or 2 weeks, they deloaded. And after deload, they measured muscle size again. And they saw that during that time off, their muscles actually grew, especially the type 1 fibers, which are the slow twitch fibers, which would make sense given that it's blood flow restriction training, which is usually using lighter weights and higher reps. And that's perhaps what slow twitch fibers respond better to.
Mm-hmm.
And there is some evidence of functional overreaching, but a lot of it is based on other fitness characteristics, like for example, endurance, where that is pretty well documented, and sports in general, where a lot of times powerlifters, for example, functionally overreach before a powerlifting competition and then deload or taper.
Taper, yeah.
And to some extent, you would expect muscle volume or size and strength to correlate, which would be somewhat associated. Mm-hmm. So I think there's a rationale for it. The evidence is lagging behind so far, but it would make sense.
I can really good remember the study. Do you remember how many participants were in the study involved? The Norwegian Bjornson study? No. I can remember the study when it came out, and I was like, yeah, that's cool and stuff.
Yeah, it was.
Anyways, I want to talk about forearm volumes. So you recently put up your specialization. I can't talk today, sorry. Template for forearms. So shameless plug here, and the link will be everywhere where I could put the link for your website this mesocycle, I was first off, my first day slept 4 days before my first training day. Then I had some sleepless nights. Then the next microcycle, the exact same training, I wasn't sleeping well, and I had some psychological stress and whatever, and I was totally flat. On week 3, I was just dragging. I couldn't do any more training. I was just overreached, to say the least. And this week I'm doing my deload, and I was thinking, I could do some forearms. I could progressively overload my forearms during my deload, and then put it in the week 1 of next mesocycle. Is it a good idea or is it a bad idea?
Well, it's not going to be a huge difference either way, because it's forearms, and forearms just don't generate that much systemic fatigue. And so even if you train your forearms pretty hard during a deload week, it's not going to interfere much with the rest of your training. But I think the same rationale applies for the forearms as for other muscle groups. So if you train them pretty hard during the mesocycle and you exceeded your MRV, then it would make sense for you to deload and take some time off to resensitize them, drop some fatigue, and allow for another mesocycle of productive training. So that's what I would say. But again, it's a small difference. It wouldn't impact your training for other muscle groups because it's such a small muscle group. You don't train them with compounds that much, usually at least directly. So that's what I'd say.
What's your MRV for forearms?
Oh man, when I train them directly, I think maybe around 20, 25 sets
per week.
Yeah, that's direct training, like wrist curls.
You do only wrist curls on the bench, or do you do standing wrist curls as well?
Sure. So I'm not a huge fan of standing wrist curls.
Okay.
When you're doing them standing, you don't actually get a full stretch on the wrist flexors, which is what you're trying to train. Because you can't really extend your forearms any further once they're perpendicular to the ground. or your wrists, I suppose. Whereas with the bench, you can actually get a full stretch on your wrist flexors. And by this point, with the whole range of motion literature and the isometric training literature, we're fairly confident that training a muscle group at long lengths, so when it's more stretched, is more hypertrophic than training it at short lengths, so when it's fully flexed or contraction, I suppose. And so it would make sense for the bench versions to be more hypertrophic than the standing versions. And I can't really see a rationale for using the standing versions unless you don't have a bench available or you've run out of exercise variation for your forearms. But again, I think there is enough variation for the forearms that shouldn't be an issue most of the time.
Can I play devil's advocate for standing wrist curls?
Sure.
The force curve is, so the contraction is like, I'm just trying to think and brainstorm here a little bit with you, but it's like when you're doing on the bench, you are horizontal, and at the peak contraction you have better peak contraction while you're standing. So it's like maybe a trade-off, maybe, I don't know. I mean, I love to put like muscles through the length, like you said, lengthened range of motion. For example, abs, I love to stretch, decline crunches. I love to stretch as far as I can because I feel like a big contract. I feel the muscle disruption to say. And but it's maybe while standing you have a better peak contraction also.
Sure. So from the evidence we have, it doesn't seem like peak contractions do all that much compared to a full stretch. And you do have a fair amount of tension in the peak contraction on a bench wrist curl. Whereas with a standing wrist curl, when you're in the fully stretched position, quote unquote, because it's not actually fully stretched, you essentially have no tension. Like you're just holding onto the bar. You're not actually producing much of a wrist flexion torque. And so there is more tension, I think, for the peak contraction on standing wrist curls. But I think that's a very, 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 very small benefit compared to the extra range of motion plus the more tension in the stretch position. So the vast majority of the time, I'd still suggest that bench wrist curls are better. And also when you consider you have to stand with the weight in your hands. You can typically use more weight. So there's more. I suppose so. Yeah, you're not wrong.
Milo, can we split the difference and say let's do it on a decline bench? So it's like 45 degrees.
I'm just thinking about that. That's interesting.
So Monday standing, Wednesday 45 degrees, and Friday, let's say bench. I'm going to try it.
Saturday, and I'm lying down.
Yeah, why not?
Why not?
I'm going to try it, and I'm going to inform you what my results are. But cool thing is, since I started training forearms, like I train it just twice a week, both of them grew. But the cool thing is that they are now equal in size. Like this left one grew 0.8 centimeters, and this right one grew 0.5 centimeters, and now they're the same. Like that's nice. A cool thing. How are we with time? What's the time?
Sure.
Let's see. We are 1 hour in. Let's wrap it up. I had one more question, but I will.
No, go for it.
No, what?
Go for it, man.
Go for it. Okay. Let's. I have a client, and he works out Monday to Thursday, and I wanna. He trained like bro split style, Monday shoulders, Thursday back and stuff, chest, legs, and is it necessary for him to do a deload before I put a new training program, like at least twice, frequency twice? And all the other stuff. Is it a good idea to do a deload first, or maybe a lower volume first week?
Sure. So necessary, not really. Beneficial, probably. It's just a good starting point. If he's been training a certain way with presumably high volumes and pretty close to failure.
Yes.
Like usually that's what goes hand in hand with.
You presume good. Yeah.
Thank you. With bro splits, that's typically how it goes. And so I think deloading fast allows you to drop training fatigue and really start from a blank slate. And so, yeah, I think it's a good idea. It's not necessary, but it's probably beneficial.
Yeah. I was thinking the same, like better to start with a blank slate and then how would you program for him? He can only train 4 days in a row. Let's not use, the most obvious way would be upper lower split, but let's use some, let's say upper body emphasis. How would you program? Like, just go with it.
Sure. So first of all, before I address the programming question, we have some evidence now showing that training a few days in a row doesn't seem to be that detrimental to progress. So we had, I think, one study where people either trained 3 days, I think it was Monday, Wednesday, Friday, versus I think Friday, Saturday, Sunday, same program, same everything. And the training outcomes as far as strength and hypertrophy go were essentially the same. Now, granted, that was in mostly untrained / not much training people, but I think it's as long as you get it in, that's the main thing. I think how you place it is a little bit less important. So with that out of the way, I think because he's been doing a bro split for so long, or presumably for a while, I would start off with reasonably low frequencies. So I don't want to jump him from 1 time a week to 4 times a week, every body part. And so I'd start with twice a week for most body parts. Now, you may have to play it smart with actual fatigue. So for example, you might not want to do a lot of RDLs, a lot of high bar squatting, a lot of deadlifts during that program, because if you're training 4 days in a row, having a sore lower back from the first lower session might then interfere with the rest of your sessions. And so that's one of the main things. More machine-based work, more lunge work, for example, where you have minimal spinal loading might be beneficial. As far as upper, lower, or push-pull legs, what have you, I wouldn't worry too much about that. I just worry about, okay, have most muscle groups trained twice a week. And then next mesocycle, you can see, okay, which muscle groups recovered just fine with 4 days in a row and twice a week. Then you can say, okay, maybe his biceps and delts recovered just fine. And so we can up that to 3 times a week. But I'd start him out on a very slow, small upgrade from a bro split, and then increase it mesocycle to mesocycle as you see how it works. Because obviously training 4 days in a row is going to be a different experience from training Monday, Wednesday, Friday, Sunday, for example. So I think it's slow.
I love the answer. I love the answer. And this hour went by so quickly. I give a word to you. You have spots open for coaching, and take it up from here.
Sure. So if you want to reach me, I'm at wolfcoach_ on Instagram. And I have a website, wolfcoaching.net. So Wolf, that's WOLF. That's my last name. I'm not just being edgy and using a cool animal as my...
You're half wolf, half human.
Exactly. So yeah, if you want to reach me on Instagram, that's where I'm most active, or my website. And if you want to get some coaching, I'd be happy to coach you. Or if you have some questions, I run Q&As pretty much all the time. And I'm happy to answer any questions to help you out.
I love your Q&As. We're going to talk a little bit off air. I'm going to say hvala što ste gledali, budite dobri jedni prema drugima, and end this